Hey, in the last lecture, we looked at the 70% calculation, 70% rule, and how we arrive at the MAO. In this lecture, we're going to look at the other side here, the other option, which is the fixed costs. Now, the only difference is instead of just using the 70% and assuming these holding costs cost the investor buyer, the flip buyer, 30% of the ARV, we're actually going to calculate it out, right? So these are some common fixed costs that are incurred by a flip investor or rehabber, right? So, if here are the costs, you can put, if you know these really well, which if you work with a lot of buyers in your market, especially if you rehab in that market, you should be able to have very accurate numbers for these, for the size of the deal, the type of the property in that particular market that you're in, okay? So there are some extra slots here that you can use to account for that. So let's say for this example, the fixed costs were 20,000. Okay. So the way the MAO using the fixed cost calculation will work is we start with the ARV, and this is again coming from the ARV, the calculation worksheet. But now instead of doing the 70% rule, we're going to subtract out these fixed costs. Okay. And then we're going to add the minimum investor profit. Basically, what is the investor trying to achieve, the investor buyer? What kind of profit do they want to make? Okay, you add that in here. You subtract out the also subtract out the rehab costs, right? So then after you account for all three, then that's the price that you can try to convince your flip buyer to purchase from you. Now, this one is something that you want to use as an approach to negotiate with your flip buyer, especially if you have them kind of work with you to itemize the costs and for them to get a really good idea of what the build out cost for the rehabs is going to be. Then you may be able to do better than the 70% rule, right? Now, if they're less experienced and they just pretty much blindly follow the 70% rule, they might be a little bit harder for you to do that. The rest of the part here is the same, right? You set what profit fees you want to make, and then it calculates your maximum MAO. Now, this is a guide here. If everybody in the market, if all your potential buyers are pretty much just following the 70% rule, then you're going to have to follow the 70% rule to calculate your MAO. Because what happens with the fixed cost method is, usually it helps you sharpen your pencils a little bit more, and oftentimes the 30% in the 70% rule kind of overstates the fixed costs, but it's not always the case. Sometimes, let's say there's some kind of a special cost here and it, raises the cost by a lot here, right? Then it's 35,000. So now if we change that, then it might actually help you calculate an MAO that's lower than what would be there in the 70% rule, okay? So, practically speaking, when you're talking to investors, most of them are going to be using a 70% rule, but it's a good idea to do this fixed costs exercise anyways, especially working through all these costs, because if you do identify some costs in your market or for that property that's actually going to be, much higher than what the 70% rule would tell you, then you won't risk over offering on that property. Okay, so that's what's the most useful aspect of this is, even if other people are just following the 70% rule. Now, this last part here is what you're thinking about in terms of the selling to a buy and hold investor. Now, for buy and hold investors, they tend to be willing to pay a little bit more. So here, this calculator is very simple here. If you're trying to sell that to a flip investor, then a buy and hold investor would be willing to pay maybe 10 to 15% more. So this is where you can put kind of that additional premium. If you say 10%, then that's what that cost would be. It would help you calculate what that cost would be, and then what your adjusted wholesaling fee would become if you were able to sell the property at this price to buy and hold type investor. Okay, so that's what this is saying over here. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to look at the other worksheets where you're presenting potentially to a flip investor.